You are listening to the Break Time Tech Talks podcast, a bite-sized tech podcast for busy developers, where we'll briefly cover technical topics, news snippets, and more in short time blocks. I'm your host, Jennifer Reif, an avid developer and problem solver with special interest in data, learning, and all things technology. Cool mornings and warm afternoons are bringing the spring busy season in with the tide. I'm tackling hard problems and puzzling through tricky situations one step at a time. This week, I worked on a Python project for a virtual meetup for San Francisco ACM next week, alongside some adjustment of perspectives on the new Java book. Finally, I got to watch a great video by Lize Raes on Langchain4j with so many goodies included. Let's dive in. Starting off, I worked on a GraphRAG presentation preparation for the upcoming meetup on Monday evening. It's a Python project using the Neo4j GraphRAG Python package. I took several iterations actually working through the knowledge graph construction portion. The goal of this project is to do some upfront knowledge graph construction using my own personal blog as the dataset, and then tweaking that as I go along, showing how you can refine just from a large language model based extracted data model, if you will, and then refine that by selecting some nodes and relationships for the LLM to create when it does create that knowledge graph, rather than letting it figure out what to create. And then further on, refining that down with just nodes as boundaries, and then nodes and relationships as boundaries, as well as patterns. And it did take me several iterations to figure out the data model that was needed, especially once I started getting into the retrieval piece of the application. The goal of the whole project was to do the knowledge graph construction piece, then do some retrievers with vector retrievers and graph retrievers and text-to-cypher retrievers. And as I started getting into the retriever piece, I realized that, my data set actually needs a few more tweaks to it in the way that I go about constructing it. So then I went back to the knowledge graph construction piece, fixed some things, adjusted things, and then moved back into the retrievers and tested that out. So just so you know, when you work on RAG or GraphRAG, you may actually need to go back to your vector store, go back to the data model that you had for your vector store, and tweak things as you go. And of course, the model that you choose is also going to change things around on that too. Now, I did find this particular data set was a bit more challenging to optimize than the previous ones I've worked with. I think because it is a bit more nebulous and broadly scoped. As I said, I'm working with my own personal blog data set, and I found this a little bit surprising that it was so challenging to create a good data model, because I feel like my topics for my blogs typically stick to Neo4j, Spring, and Java, with a few variations along those lines, but pretty much those general topics is a lot of what I cover. So I figured it would be pretty consistent and easy to reason about, I guess. When I actually got into it, I realized there's a lot more variation. There's a few additional concepts or things that are odds and ends in some blog posts and not in others. And it just made it a little bit more diverse, I think, than what I was anticipating. I did need to frame the model to align with some of the questions that I was expecting to ask or wanting to ask of that data set. I found out that letting the model decide all of the entities and relationships left it way too many options, and you ended up with a huge scattered data model, so it was way too much. Then I have another script that goes through and just provides some node types, and still you end up with way too many relationship types out of that. So it's just a little bit too narrow focused when the LLM extracts the data to create the model. Then I framed it down into, now I'm going to provide nodes, relationships, and some patterns. So basically how to construct those nodes and relationships into patterns, and offer that as, here, follow this as a baseline. And it did much, much better. Now, again, when you set those boundaries for those entity types, it did help quite a bit, because now I'm able to construct queries within that. It doesn't have a massive amount of variety. It doesn't have too many things to choose from when it's trying to do things like text-to-cypher. So it does narrow that focus quite a bit, and that helps a lot. However, the downside of this is that does box you in a bit on the types of questions that you might best be able to answer. For instance, if you ask something that might be way out of bounds for the data model, it probably won't know what to do with it. You may need to add in some guardrails or maybe some additional examples in the text-to-cypher, for instance, in order to have it handle things that are a little bit unusually worded or things that it doesn't know how to put those into the context of the model. Now, once I got the knowledge graph construction piece and the retriever piece working, then I needed to tackle a little bit of agentic stuff because I wanted to be able to showcase a bit of agents. And then I needed a few more refinements after I started digging into this. I needed to tweak some of the tool descriptions and then the text-to-cypher examples. I played around a lot with those. For instance, what types of questions might I want to ask? What are the different types of entities and relationships and patterns that I might want it to traverse? So I needed to provide examples and example questions for each one of those situations that I wanted it to cover, covering the gamut of things that I might want it to ask. I needed to provide good examples there. And then the tool descriptions needed to be very descriptive and yet distinctive between the three different tools that I had to offer. I have a tool for a database schema, I have a tool for vector plus GraphRAG, and then I have a tool for text-to-cypher. And I needed to be able to let the agent decide based on the question that was coming in, which tool should it use and best suits the task at hand. So I need to make those descriptions very clear and yet distinctive enough that it knows which tool to choose every time and it's the right tool. I had to do some adjustment there, but I think I have it in pretty good shape now. I am super excited to speak on this topic on Monday night. Again, we are talking GraphRAG, so we're going to be covering knowledge graph construction, how to do the actual retrieval piece of that, and I'll touch on a bit of the agentic architecture when you're looking at GraphRAG and some other tools. All right, other things that I worked on this week. I did make some progress on the Java book. I did get some external feedback on the book generally. And so I took a look at the first few chapters through a different lens just to review and make sure I was thinking of things in the right way. I did make a few changes based on that, and I do think that this perspective will be helpful throughout the rest of the writing that I do. I need to make some more traction on the writing, but I am getting there slowly but surely. I do have a few other things going on as well. I had a few things on the schedule shift a bit, which does give a bit more breathing room to dig in on some things. So I'm really excited about that. It also gives me some space to assist colleagues with some other tasks and projects and pick up some other small things that I've been wanting to do for a while too. I'm very thrilled about that, and yet looking forward to some upcoming events that are now stretched out a little bit more and give me some time to prepare and breathe. The content piece that I had a chance to watch this week is a YouTube video, and it's called Level Up Your Langchain4j Apps for Production. This was a presentation by Lize Raes from Devoxx Belgium last year, and it was really great. I had seen it pop up, and I just hadn't had a chance to watch it, and I was really excited to sit down and actually move through this. I believe that Lize does a great job on this. First off, she starts off talking about retrieval augmented generation and the opportunities that Langchain4j offers there. A lot of this was some tidbits, some tips and tricks, maybe a few, lesser known things that you might not know about in Langchain4j. And I found these really, really cool and definitely a lot of things that I want to try. Talking first about RAG, she talked a little bit about filtering and the different filters that are available in Langchain4j, some of which I already knew about. However, she says that tools are the better way to go because you can call that multiple times. For instance, when you have a single shot retrieval augmented generation where you plug it in to do a semantic similarity search through a framework and it sends it to the LLM and comes back, that's a single shot. So it does it in one round trip and you're done. That's it. However, if you set up your retrieval augmented generation as a tool and you let an agent figure out how to call that, for instance, if it gets an answer back and it doesn't feel like it's a good enough answer, it might call that tool again and possibly again. Of course, you could set a limit on how many tool calls it might make so it doesn't go crazy, but allowing it to call multiple different things and pull in as much information as it might need to can give you much better results on the other side. I thought this was a really great tidbit, and something that I have started to notice as I'm developing more applications is that agentic approaches tend to do better for retrieval augmented generation and applications in those veins. However, I just hadn't framed it in this way as Lize did. All right, there's also a way to write specific tool filters, which I had never considered before. I have heard many, many things about applications or systems that have tens, hundreds, potentially thousands of tools at their disposal, and that gets really confusing for agentic applications. But there is actually a way to write specific tool filters. Now, this is a somewhat manual way. Lize walks through an example of this actually, where you could say, okay, if you're talking about bookings and you get questions about bookings, you can select from these sets of tools and you define all the tools that are related to bookings. If you get questions on accounts, you might have a different set of tools. So you could actually deterministically or programmatically, in this case, filter down that list. If you have a term of booking or account, pick from this set of tools. That does filter it down quite a bit. The agent doesn't have to choose from hundreds. It's now choosing from 10 or 15 potentially, or 5, whatever it might happen to be. Another one is that you can set up a tool that is a sub-agent that has sub-tools. We've heard of this multi-agent approach or sub-agent approach where you have an agent that could call other agents. And Lize actually shows an example of this working. She sets up an assistant class, an AI assistant basically. And then she uses that assistant, tags it as an at tool, and plugs that into another assistant. So then that AI assistant can actually use the other assistant as a tool, which I thought was really cool and really clever. And it was just really nice to see an example of this live. Now, of course, I'd want to plug this into my own demos and play around with it as well. But I thought this was really cool and definitely opened the door for, that's how this works. Then there actually is a way to skip the large language model call and return a deterministic response, which is going to save you time and tokens. So some of the latency and definitely the tokens, because you're not making that large language model call. The way that Lize shows this off is there's an immediate response, which means that it uses an agent to figure out which tool to call, but then it's returning an object or a JSON or whatever it is. And it doesn't need to send those results to an LLM to summarize or to provide a natural language result. In this case, it goes and it calls the tool, it gets the result, and then it doesn't need to go to the LLM again. It just returns that response back as the object or the data set or whatever it is you're wanting to return. I thought this was a really nice example of this too. This gets into niceties where you might not always want to return a big text string, or you might not always need the large language model to provide a formatted response in the output. And I really liked this approach for here's how you can skip that extra large language model hop by just circumnavigating that inside the application itself and doing that programmatically. Lize also talks about MCP a bit, the goods, the bads, what it is. Highlights and just touches on agentic, the 3 different types of agents. There's code examples available on the repository, and then talks to close out the session about production grade agentic systems. You can decompose the very complex tasks with agents that an LLM doesn't really handle well. If you pass large complex tasks to large language models, they don't tend to handle those very well. Agents are a way to decompose those into much smaller tasks and offer intermediary controls, some checks, and some customization options as well. For instance, using small models for certain tasks, larger, more complex models for certain tasks, and customizing that depending on what you need in your application. To cover the production grade agentic systems and what all you need, Lize steps through the process applying to a actual use case. She uses an HR example, how you would want to integrate AI into your HR process and how you might go about helping HR do that. There are 13 steps, and she walks through each one related to this particular use case. They have to do with setting up your requirements, architecting the solution, actually prototyping and getting good estimates out of it, then doing a lot of checking and error handling and testing things, checking the security and resiliency and figuring out how to optimize the system, then figuring out how to test it and do observability and monitoring and maintaining after the fact. The way that she wraps up the full session is she does a medical research demo in the last just few seconds of time. What I really loved about the session is how much was covered and the many, many tidbits that I wasn't aware of and I really wanted to play with. While the Python project posed some challenges this week that have been different from my experience in Java, it was really helpful to stretch my brain in new ways. I'm excited to present at the meetup on Monday. Then listening to Lize's presentation recording has me curious to pick up Langchain4j again and test out some of the things that she mentioned in her session. Catch you next week. Thanks for listening and happy coding.